black CEO saw a boy cleaning tables after school. What he learned changed his life, forever. Julian Vance existed in a world of glass and quiet altitude. His office, a minimalist expanse on the 80th floor, surveyed the city like a detached god. Below, the metropolis was a frantic, silent ballet of lights and motion, a universe he commanded but no longer felt a part of. The silence in the room was a physical presence, thick and cold, broken only by the soft hum of the climate control system that kept the world at a perfect, sterile temperature. He stood before the floor-to-ceiling window, a silhouette in a suit that cost more than the cars crawling like insects below. The glass was cool against his fingertips. Outside, a late autumn wind was tearing through the canyons of steel, but in here there was no weather. There was only the quiet, the stillness, and the ghost of a memory that lived in the empty leather chair across from his desk. A smaller chair, one that had been empty for 5 years. Grief was no longer a storm for Julian. It had settled into a permanent climate, a low-pressure system in his soul that muted colors and dulled sensation. He was successful, powerful, a titan of industry whose name was a synonym for innovation. But he was hollow, a magnificent structure with no one living inside. The chandeliers in his penthouse were shaped like frozen stars, and he often felt like one himself, brilliant, distant, and cold to the core. Tonight, the hollowness was an ache. It was the anniversary of the silence, the day the laughter had stopped. He needed to escape the tomb of his own making, to feel something other than the polished chill of his life. He bypassed the waiting limousine, the expectant doorman, and walked into the city's raw, biting wind. The cold was a shock, a blade against his skin, and for a moment it felt like a mercy. It felt real. Elena Ramirez lived in a world of cold metal and quiet desperation. Her home was a dented Ford pickup truck parked in the forgotten corner of a vast, soulless parking lot. The wind found every crack and seam in the old vehicle, whispering threats of the coming winter. She sat in the driver's seat, watching her son, Leo, through the steamy window of a small, brightly lit cafe across the street. Her world had shrunk to the dimensions of this truck cab. In it were the last remnants of her old life, a worn photograph of her husband, his smile a painful memory of warmth, a stack of resumes with her name on them, each one a testament to unanswered hope, and in the passenger seat, a small, sleeping boy who was her entire universe. Leo was 8. He had his father's eyes and a quiet dignity that broke her heart. Every day he put on a brave face, a small soldier in a war he did not choose. He never complained about the cold or the cramped space or the meals that were often too small. He just held her hand, his small fingers a warm anchor in the freezing tide of their life. A few weeks ago, the manager of the cafe, a tired but kind woman, had noticed Leo diligently doing his homework under the street lamp while Elena searched for work. She had offered him a small arrangement. For an hour after school, he could wipe down tables in exchange for a hot meal and a place to stay warm. It was charity dressed as a job, a kindness Elena had swallowed her pride to accept. Her own job, a good one in administration, had vanished after a corporate buyout, and with it, their apartment, their stability, their future. Now she watched him, a small figure moving between the empty tables, a damp cloth in his hand. He worked with a meticulous focus that was so much older than his years. He wasn't just wiping tables, he was caring for them, his movements careful and deliberate. Each clean surface was a small victory against the chaos that surrounded them. The sight was a mixture of crushing pride and profound failure that lived in her chest like a stone. Julian walked for blocks, letting the city's noise wash over him. The sounds were sharp, abrasive, a welcome contrast to the oppressive quiet of his life. He found himself outside a small cafe, its windows glowing with a warm, buttery light. It looked unpretentious, real. On an impulse he didn't understand, he pushed open the door. The smell of coffee and baked bread wrapped around him, a forgotten comfort. He took a seat at a small table in the corner, the polished wood worn smooth by 1,000 other hands. He ordered a black coffee he didn't want and stared into its dark, reflective surface. He saw the face of a stranger, a man who had everything and nothing. He must have been lost in thought, his hand unsteady, because the cup slipped. Hot coffee spilled across the table, a dark, spreading stain. He swore softly under his breath, a flicker of irritation breaking through his apathy. He reached for a napkin, but a small shadow fell over the table. He looked up. A boy, no older than 8 or 9, stood there. He was small for his age, with large, serious brown eyes. He held a damp cloth in one hand. The boy didn't say a word. He simply reached forward and began to wipe up the spill, his small hands moving with an earnest, focused grace. He worked around Julian's expensive coat sleeve, his movements precise and careful. Julian watched, frozen. There was no request for a tip in the boy's eyes, no hint of servitude. There was only a quiet diligence, a simple, unasked-for act of service. The boy meticulously cleaned the entire surface, leaving the wood gleaming under the soft lights. Then he looked at Julian, a flicker of a smile touching his lips. It was a soft, gentle thing. "It's okay," he said softly, his voice barely a whisper. "Accidents happen." The boy turned and walked away, back to his work, leaving Julian staring at the clean table. The simple words echoed in the vast, silent chambers of Julian's heart. Accidents happen. A phrase of simple forgiveness, of gentle understanding. For 5 years, he had been living in the wreckage of an accident, a singular moment of chance and physics that had stolen his world. No one had ever said those words to him. He felt a strange warmth spreading through his chest, an unfamiliar thawing around the edges of his frozen grief. It wasn't pity he felt for the boy. It was something else, a connection, a flicker of light in a place that had been dark for a very long time. He looked at the boy again, really looked. He saw the worn sneakers, the too thin jacket, the determined set of his small jaw. He saw a quiet strength that Julian, with all his power and wealth, had long since lost. He didn't know the boy's name. He didn't know his story. But in that small, selfless act, Julian Vance felt the first faint pulse of his own humanity returning. He sat in the warm cafe, the city's cold wind forgotten, and for the first time in 5 years, he wanted to know more. The next morning, the memory of the boy's quiet grace followed Julian into the silent austerity of his office. It was a small, warm ember in the cold expanse of his day. He sat at his mahogany desk, the city spread out beneath him, but his mind was in that small cafe, watching a child clean a table with more care than most people put into their entire lives. He buzzed his assistant. Marcus was more than an assistant. He was a fixer, a confidant, a man of quiet efficiency who had been with Julian since before the silence began. He was one of the few people who knew the depth of the emptiness that lurked beneath Julian's powerful exterior. "Marcus," Julian began, his voice even, betraying nothing of the strange turmoil within him, "I need you to find out about a boy." He described the cafe, the time, the boy's appearance. He left out the spilled coffee, the feeling of connection. He framed it as a passing curiosity, a whim. But Marcus, who could read the subtle shifts in Julian's tone like a stock market ticker, knew it was more. He simply nodded. "I'll handle it, Mr. Vance." Elena woke to the familiar chill of the truck's interior. The windows were frosted over with a delicate, cruel lace. Leo was still asleep beside her, his breath a small white cloud in the frigid air. She tucked the thin blanket more tightly around him, her heart aching with a love so fierce it was a physical pain. She felt the familiar gnaw of hunger, the constant low-grade panic that was the soundtrack of her life. Every morning was a battle between hope and despair. She would get ready in the sterile bathroom of a 24-hour gas station, forcing a look of professional composure onto her face, and spend the day walking from one office to another, handing out resumes that felt like pleas. The rejections were always polite, always impersonal, and each one chipped away another piece of her spirit. Today, however, there was a small difference. Tucked into the windshield wiper of the truck was a plain white envelope. Her heart leaped with a wild, foolish hope. A job offer? A response? She tore it open with trembling fingers. Inside was not a letter, but cash. $500 in crisp, clean bills. There was no note, no explanation, just the money. Elena stared at it, her mind racing. Who? Why? Her first instinct was suspicion, a fear that it was a trick, a cruel joke. But as she looked at Leo's sleeping face, another feeling washed over her. Relief. A profound, bone-deep relief that tasted like tears. This money meant a real meal for Leo. It meant a new pair of shoes to replace his worn-out ones. It meant a few nights in a cheap motel, a real bed, a hot shower. It was a lifeline. She didn't know it was from an angel in a glass tower. She thought it was a miracle, a moment of anonymous grace in a world that had shown her little. She held the money to her chest and whispered a thank you to the universe, to whoever had seen their invisible struggle. Marcus delivered his report that afternoon. It was concise, thorough, and utterly devastating. The boy's name was Leo Ramirez. He was 8 years old. He and his mother, Elena Ramirez, were homeless. They lived in a 1998 Ford F-150. Marcus had included a photograph of the truck, parked in its usual spot. It looked small and vulnerable against the urban sprawl. The report detailed Elena's story. A widow. Her husband, a construction worker, had died in a workplace accident 2 years prior. The settlement had been small, eaten up by debts. She had been a respected office manager for a mid-sized firm for over a decade. The company was acquired 6 months ago. She was laid off, replaced by someone younger, cheaper. Her references were impeccable. Her work history was a testament to loyalty and competence. She was, by all accounts, a good person crushed by bad luck. Julian read the report, and the ember of warmth in his chest flared into a protective fire. He saw not a charity case, but a reflection of his own loss. He, too, had been a victim of a cruel accident. The difference was, he had been insulated by a fortress of wealth. Elena and Leo had nothing but each other. He looked at the photograph of the truck again. He imagined the cold, the fear, the constant uncertainty. And he imagined Leo, a small boy in that cold metal box, who still had the grace to clean a stranger's mess without a word of complaint. "What else, Marcus?" Julian asked, his voice low. "The boy, Leo," Marcus said softly. "He has a persistent cough. According to a note I found in the public school's records, the school nurse has recommended he see a doctor, but there's no record of a follow-up. They have no insurance." The words hit Julian like a physical blow. He thought of his own daughter, Lily. When she was 6, she had scraped her knee. He had flown in a specialist from another state just to be sure the stitches were perfect. The disparity, the sheer brutal unfairness of it all settled in his bones. That night, Julian didn't go home to his silent penthouse. He had Marcus drive him to the edge of the parking lot where the truck was parked. From the tinted windows of his Rolls-Royce, a spaceship of wealth and privilege, he watched. A small, battery-powered lamp glowed inside the truck's cab. He could see their silhouettes, a mother reading to her son. It was the most intimate, heartbreakingly beautiful thing he had ever seen. A tiny island of love and warmth in a vast, cold ocean of indifference. He saw Elena stroke Leo's hair. He saw the boy lean his head against her shoulder. In that small, cramped space, there was more love than in all 80 floors of his skyscraper. He felt a profound sense of shame, not for his wealth, but for his detachment. He had been so lost in his own grief that he had forgotten how to see the world around him. This woman, this boy. They were not a project. They were a reminder of what was real, what mattered. "Marcus," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. "Find them a place to live, an apartment, furnish it, pay a year's rent in advance, and find a way to get that boy to a doctor, anonymously. I don't want them to know it's me." "Yes, Mr. Vance," Marcus replied, his voice betraying no surprise. He had been waiting for 5 years for the king in the glass castle to remember he had a heart. A few days later, another miracle arrived for Elena. A letter from a non-profit she had never heard of, offering her a fully funded apartment for 1 year as part of a new family stability program. It felt too good to be true. She read the letter a dozen times, her hands shaking. She called the number, her voice trembling, expecting a catch, a scam. But it was real. A kind voice on the other end of the line explained everything. The apartment was ready. It was furnished. All she had to do was pick up the keys. Walking into the apartment was like stepping into a dream. It was small, simple, but it was clean and warm. There were 2 beds, a small kitchen stocked with food, and a living room with a comfortable-looking sofa. Leo ran from room to room, his face alight with a joy so pure it made Elena weep. He jumped on his new bed, laughing, the sound echoing in the small space. It was the first time she had heard him laugh like that in months. That night, tucked into a warm, soft bed, with Leo sleeping soundly in the next room, Elena cried. They were tears of gratitude, of relief, of a hope she thought had been extinguished forever. She still didn't know who was behind it all, but she sent a prayer of thanks out into the darkness to her unknown benefactor, a faceless saint who had answered a prayer she had been too tired to even whisper. The next piece of the puzzle fell into place a week later. A call from a prestigious pediatric clinic, a community outreach program, had selected Leo for a free, comprehensive health screening. An appointment was already made. Elena's skepticism was now warring with a sense of wonder. The world, which had been so cruel, was suddenly, inexplicably kind. The clinic was clean and bright, a world away from the crowded, chaotic free clinics she had tried to navigate before. The doctor was gentle, thorough, and spoke to Leo with respect and warmth. He diagnosed a burgeoning case of bronchitis, exacerbated by exposure to the cold and damp. It was treatable, but it could have become pneumonia, something far more dangerous. He sent them home with a bag full of medication, all covered by the program. Julian received the doctor's report via Marcus. Bronchitis. The word felt like a judgment on him. While he had been living in climate-controlled perfection, a child had been getting sick in the cold. The thought solidified his resolve. Anonymous help was not enough. He needed to do more. He needed to ensure they were never in that position again. Marcus's research had uncovered Elena's professional history. She was more than competent. She was exceptional. Her old boss had written a glowing letter of recommendation, calling her the organizational backbone of his company. Julian looked at the portfolio of her work, streamlined processes, cost-saving initiatives, projects managed with flawless efficiency. He had an opening in his own company. The director of his charitable foundation, a multi-billion-dollar endeavor that was his late wife's legacy, had just retired. The role required organizational genius, empathy, and a deep understanding of what it meant to struggle. It was a role that seemed tailor-made for Elena Ramirez. Offering her the job, however, would shatter his anonymity. It would mean stepping out from behind the curtain of his wealth and facing her directly. It would mean confronting the strange, powerful emotions this woman and her son had stirred in him. The thought was terrifying. It was also the only thing that felt right. He scheduled an interview. The request came through a high-end recruitment agency, masking its true origin. The message was formal, inviting Elena Ramirez to an interview for a senior position at Vance Industries. When Elena received the email, she thought it was a mistake. Vance Industries was a legend, a corporate Everest. Julian Vance was a figure of almost mythical proportions in the city. She, a woman who had been living in her truck a few weeks ago, interviewing at a place like that. It was impossible. But hope, now a tenacious vine in her heart, urged her on. She had nothing to lose. She spent 2 days preparing, researching the company, its foundation, its mission. She used some of the miracle money to buy a simple, professional suit from a thrift store. On the day of the interview, she walked into the lobby of the Vance Tower, a cathedral of chrome and marble. She felt small, an imposter in a world of power and success. She clutched her worn portfolio to her chest, took a deep breath, and walked towards the elevator that would take her to the 80th floor. Julian waited in his office, his heart hammering against his ribs with an unfamiliar rhythm. He was more nervous than he had been before any billion-dollar negotiation. He had seen this woman at her most vulnerable, a silhouette in a truck cab. Now he would meet her as a peer, an applicant. The door opened, and Marcus showed her in. She was even more striking in person. There were tired lines around her eyes, but those eyes were intelligent, clear, and full of a quiet, unbreakable dignity. She stood before him, poised and professional, and for a moment he couldn't speak. "Mr. Vance," she said, her voice steady, though he could see the slight tremor in her hands. "Thank you for seeing me." He motioned for her to sit in the chair opposite him, not the ghost chair, but another, one he had Marcus bring in. "Elena," he said, the name feeling soft on his tongue. "Thank you for coming." The interview began. He asked her questions about her experience, her philosophy on philanthropy, her ideas for community outreach. Her answers were brilliant. They were not just textbook responses. They were forged in the crucible of her own experience. She spoke of dignity, of providing a hand up, not a handout. She spoke of the small things that make the biggest difference: a warm bed, a doctor's visit, the chance to work. As she spoke, Julian was no longer seeing a candidate for a job. He was seeing the woman who had raised a son with grace and love in the face of unimaginable hardship. He was seeing the quiet strength he had only glimpsed from afar. Halfway through the interview, he stopped her. "Elena," he said, his voice softer now, "I have to be honest with you." He saw a flicker of fear in her eyes, the expectation of rejection. "The apartment," he said quietly. "The doctor's visit for Leo. That was me." Elena stared at him, her face a mask of confusion, then dawning realization. Her mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. She looked around the opulent office at this powerful man and tried to connect him to the anonymous kindness that had saved her. "Why?" she finally whispered, the word fragile in the quiet room. Julian got up and walked to the window, his back to her. He couldn't face her as he said the next words. "I was in the cafe," he began, his voice low. "A few weeks ago, I saw your son." He paused, gathering himself. "I saw him cleaning my table. I spilled my coffee, and he just cleaned it up. He told me accidents happen." He turned back to face her. Her eyes were wide, glistening with unshed tears. "No one has shown me that kind of simple, undeserved grace in a very long time," he continued, his voice thick with emotion. "Your son, in that one small moment, reminded me of something I had forgotten, something about goodness, about decency." He walked back to his desk and sat down, leaning forward, his gaze locked with hers. "I didn't offer you this interview out of charity, Elena. I offered it because, after I learned who you were, after I saw your professional history, I knew you were the most qualified person for this job. You don't just understand this foundation's mission, you've lived it." He pushed a contract across the desk. "The job is yours, if you want it." Elena looked from his face to the papers on the desk. Her mind was reeling, trying to process the sheer, stunning improbability of it all. This titan of industry, this remote and powerful man, had been moved by her little boy wiping up a coffee spill. It was a fairy tale, a dream. But the contract on the desk was real. The warmth in his eyes was real. Tears she had held back for months finally fell, tracing silent paths down her cheeks. They were not tears of sadness or self-pity. They were tears of catharsis, of a dam of fear and exhaustion finally breaking. "Yes," she whispered, her voice choked. "Yes, thank you." In the quiet of the 80th floor office, surrounded by the silent city, two lonely souls, brought together by a child's simple act of kindness, had finally found a connection. It was the beginning of a new chapter, a fragile seed of hope planted in the frozen ground of their pasts. Life transformed for Elena and Leo. The world, which had once been a landscape of sharp edges and cold surfaces, softened into a place of warmth and possibility. Their small apartment became a true home, filled with the smell of home-cooked meals and the sound of Leo's laughter. The constant, gnawing anxiety that had been Elena's companion for so long was replaced by a quiet, steady sense of peace. Her new role was not just a job, it was a calling. She poured her heart into the Vance Foundation, her past hardships giving her a unique and profound empathy. She wasn't just managing budgets and projects, she was changing lives, She launched initiatives for homeless families, created educational grants, and built partnerships with community shelters. She had a voice, and she used it to speak for those who, like her, had once been invisible. Julian watched her, amazed. She moved through his world with a grace and competence that was breathtaking. She was a natural leader, her quiet dignity earning the respect of everyone she met. He saw the light return to her eyes, the confidence settle back into her shoulders. He saw her healing, and in watching her heal, he found himself healing too. The oppressive silence of his life began to recede, replaced by the soft hum of purpose. He started leaving the office at a reasonable hour. He found himself looking forward to the daily reports from Elena, not just for the professional updates, but for the chance to hear her voice, to see her passion. Their relationship was professional, but underneath the surface, something deeper was growing. It was in the shared glances across a boardroom table, the lingering conversations at the end of the day, the easy comfort that settled between them in moments of quiet. Leo was the bridge between their two worlds. Julian found himself making excuses to visit the community centers where Leo attended after-school programs funded by the foundation. He would watch the boy, now healthy and thriving, playing with other children, his face free from the adult worries it had once carried. One afternoon, Julian found Leo sitting alone, sketching in a notepad. He sat down beside him. "What are you drawing?" he asked softly. Leo showed him the picture. It was a drawing of 3 stick figures holding hands. One was tall, labeled Mr. Vance. One was a woman with long hair, Mom. And in the middle was a small boy, me. Underneath, Leo had written, "My new family." Julian stared at the drawing, his heart constricting. The simple, innocent hope in the child's drawing was more powerful than any contract, more valuable than any asset he owned. He felt a wave of love for this boy, so fierce and protective it stole his breath. And with it came a terrifying, wonderful realization. He was falling in love with Leo's mother. Just as this new, fragile world was taking shape, the old, cruel world intruded. A sensationalist online tabloid published a story. The headline was a poisoned dart. Homeless woman seduces billionaire CEO, the ultimate gold digger. The article was a brutal tapestry of half-truths and malicious lies, likely leaked by a disgruntled, jealous former colleague of Elena's. It painted her as a manipulative schemer who had used her son to trap the grieving, vulnerable Julian Vance. It twisted their story from one of kindness and chance into a sordid, calculated affair. The story spread like wildfire. It was picked up by other news outlets, discussed on television, debated in the viper pit of social media. Elena's name, once anonymous, was now infamous. Her photograph was everywhere. For Elena, the attack was devastating. It stripped away her newfound confidence and plunged her back into the darkness of shame and unworthiness. The words gold digger, schemer, charity case echoed in her head, reinforcing all the secret fears she had harbored. She felt like a fraud, a stain on Julian's pristine reputation. She saw the whispers, the sideways glances from colleagues. The warmth and respect she had earned seemed to evaporate overnight, replaced by suspicion and pity. The world once again felt hostile, its edges sharp and dangerous. She started to believe what they were saying. Maybe they were right. Maybe she was just a burden, a complication in Julian's life. Julian's reaction was a cold, quiet fury. He wanted to use his power to crush the tabloid, to sue them into oblivion. His legal team was already mobilized, but he knew that a public fight would only add fuel to the fire, dragging Elena further into the mud. The real damage was not to his reputation. He cared little for that, but to Elena. He saw the light dim in her eyes again. He saw her withdraw, building walls around her heart. He tried to talk to her, to reassure her, but she was distant, lost in her own pain. One evening, he went to her apartment. She opened the door, her face pale and drawn. The warmth of her home felt muted, the air thick with tension. "I have to leave, Julian," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She wouldn't meet his eyes. "I can't do this to you. I can't be this scandal in your life. I'll resign from the foundation. We'll move. You've given us so much, more than we ever deserved. We'll be fine." "No," Julian said, his voice firm. "Don't let them do this. Don't let their ugliness destroy what we're building." "What are we building?" she asked, a flash of pain in her eyes as she finally looked at him. "Julian, I'm a woman you felt sorry for, your charity case, and now I'm your problem. This isn't real." Her words were a knife in his heart because they touched upon his own deepest fears. Had it started as pity? Was he trying to fix her life to somehow atone for his inability to save his own family? The doubt, planted by the public scandal, took root in the space between them. "Elena, that's not true," he pleaded, but his own uncertainty weakened his voice. She shook her head, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. "Please, Julian, just let us go. It's better this way." He left her apartment that night feeling a familiar, chilling emptiness. The silence was returning. The walls were going back up. He had found a glimmer of light, a chance at a second life, and now the darkness was threatening to swallow it whole. He felt defeated, not by a corporate rival or a market crash, but by the poison of public opinion and the fragility of a healing heart. He stood on the precipice of losing everything that had come to matter to him, all over again. Julian spent the night in his glass tower, but for the first time, it didn't feel like a fortress. It felt like a prison. He watched the sun rise over the city, the light spilling over the horizon, but it brought no warmth. Elena's words echoed in his mind. "This isn't real." He realized that his anonymous interventions, his quiet support from a distance, had created this doubt. He had tried to protect her, but in doing so, he had robbed their connection of its public truth. He had let the world define it, and the world had defined it as something ugly. He had to reclaim the narrative. He had to tell their story, his story, in his own words. Not with lawyers and press releases, but with the raw, undeniable truth. He called Marcus. "Cancel my morning and call a press conference for this afternoon. At the new community center the foundation just opened." "Mr. Vance," Marcus cautioned, "your legal team strongly advises against making any public statements." "I'm not interested in their advice," Julian said, his voice imbued with a clarity and purpose he hadn't felt in years. "It's time I stopped hiding." Elena spent the morning packing, each item she placed in a box. Leo's drawings, the books Julian had bought him, a small vase he'd given her for her desk, was a fresh wave of pain. Leaving felt like an amputation, cutting off a part of herself that had just begun to grow. But she believed it was the only way to protect Julian, the only way to repay his kindness. She would not be the anchor that dragged him down. Her phone buzzed with a notification, a news alert. billionaire Julian Vance to address scandal in live press conference. Her heart stopped. What was he going to do? Deny her? Distance himself to save his company? She couldn't bear to watch, but she couldn't look away. She turned on the small television in the living room, her hands trembling. The press conference was held not in a sterile corporate boardroom, but in the sunlit main hall of the Foundation's new community center, the first project Elena had overseen from start to finish. The room was packed with reporters, the air crackling with the flash of cameras. Julian walked to the podium. He looked directly into the cameras, his gaze steady and unflinching. He didn't look like a man in crisis. He looked like a man who had finally found his footing. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice calm and clear, resonating through the room. "I'm not here today to talk about stock prices or corporate acquisitions. I'm here to talk about something more important. I'm here to talk about kindness and courage and second chances." He paused, letting the words settle. "For the past 5 years, since I lost my wife, Amelia, and my daughter Lily, in a car accident." His voice broke for a fraction of a second, the first public crack in his iron facade. He took a breath and continued. "I have been living in a world without light. I built a fortress of wealth and success around me, but it was a cold and empty place. I was, for all intents and purposes, a ghost." Watching on her television, Elena pressed a hand to her mouth. He had never spoken their names in public. "And then," Julian went on, his eyes finding a specific camera as if he were looking right at her. "A few months ago, a small boy I had never met showed me a moment of pure, unprompted kindness. He didn't want anything. He just saw a stranger who had made a mess and quietly, gracefully, cleaned it up. He reminded me that there was still goodness in the world. That small act was the first flicker of light I had seen in 5 years. He told them everything. How he had found the boy and his mother, Elena Ramirez, living in a truck, victims of circumstance, but not of spirit. He spoke of her impeccable professional record, her dignity, her strength. "The tabloids want you to believe a story about a gold digger and a fool," he said, his voice ringing with conviction. "But that is a story for people who believe in the worst of humanity. I am here to tell you the true story. It is a story about a woman of incredible strength and integrity who was fighting an impossible battle. It is the story of a man who was so lost in his own grief he had forgotten how to feel. It is a story about how her courage and her son's decency saved my life. They didn't take anything from me. They gave me back my soul." The room was utterly silent. The reporters had lowered their cameras, listening, captivated. "Elena Ramirez is not my charity case," Julian declared, his voice rising with passion. "She is the brilliant and compassionate director of my foundation. She is the most decent person I have ever known. She is the woman I love." Elena gasped, tears streaming down her face. He loved her. He had said it to the entire world. All the doubt, all the shame, all the fear that had held her captive, shattered in that one moment. It was real. His feelings, their connection. It was all real. "And if any of you," Julian concluded, his gaze sweeping across the room, "are more interested in printing cynical lies than in celebrating a story of human resilience and hope, then I truly pity you. Because you are as blind as I was." He stepped back from the podium, not taking any questions, and walked out of the room, leaving a stunned and silent press corps behind him. Elena sank to the floor, her body shaking with sobs of profound, overwhelming relief. It was not fear, not defeat, but hope. A hope so bright and powerful, it felt like the sun. The weeks that followed the press conference were a quiet dawn. The storm of the scandal broke, replaced by a new narrative, one of hope, love, and redemption. The public, moved by Julian's raw honesty, embraced their story. Elena was no longer a villain. She was an inspiration. With the truth out in the open, the space between them was finally clear. The doubt was gone, replaced by a deep and abiding certainty. They spent their evenings together, not as a CEO and his employee, but as two people building a life. They talked for hours, sharing the stories of their pasts, the pains they had carried alone for so long. Julian spoke of Amelia and Lily, not with the hollow ache of grief, but with the warm glow of loving memory. Elena spoke of her late husband, of their dreams, of the life they had lost. They were two incomplete souls, finding wholeness in each other. Their home was no longer just Elena's apartment or Julian's penthouse. It was wherever the three of them were together. Julian taught Leo how to throw a baseball in the park. Elena taught Julian how to cook her mother's recipes in the small apartment kitchen. They ate dinner together, helped Leo with his homework, and read him bedtime stories. They were not playing house. They were building a home, brick by brick, with quiet moments of ordinary, extraordinary love. The foundation thrived under Elena's leadership and Julian's renewed passion. They became a formidable team, their shared purpose a powerful bond between them. They were no longer just helping people from a distance. They were on the ground, their hands and hearts invested in the community they were building. One crisp autumn evening, a year to the day after Julian had first walked into that small cafe, he took Elena and Leo back there. The same kind manager was behind the counter, her eyes wide with recognition and warmth. They sat at the very same table where he had spilled his coffee. "This is where our life started," Julian said softly, his hand covering Elena's on the worn wooden tabletop. He looked at her, his eyes full of a love so deep it felt as vast and quiet as the night sky. "Elena Ramirez, you walked into my life, and you turned on all the lights. You and Leo taught me how to live again, how to love again. I don't want to spend another day without you as my wife." He slid a small box across the table. Elena opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was a simple, elegant ring, but nestled beside it was a small brass key. "What's this?" she whispered, her eyes glistening. "It's the key to our home," he said. "A house not far from here, with a big yard for Leo to play in, and enough room for our family to grow." Leo, who had been listening with wide, serious eyes, broke into a huge grin. "Are you asking my mom to marry you?" he asked, his voice full of excitement. Julian smiled, his gaze never leaving Elena's. "I am, but I have to ask your permission too. Is it okay if I join your family?" "Yes," Leo shouted, launching himself across the booth to hug Julian. "I already drew the picture." Elena laughed through her happy tears. She looked at this incredible man who had seen them when they were invisible, who had fought for them, who loved them with his whole, healed heart. "Yes," she said, her voice full of all the love and gratitude she possessed. "Yes, 1,000 times. Yes." Their wedding was not a grand affair for the society pages. It was a small, quiet ceremony held in the sunlit hall of the community center they had built together. Marcus was Julian's best man. Leo, in a small suit, stood between them, holding both of their hands. Their vows were not flowery promises, but simple, heartfelt truths. They spoke of finding light in the darkness, of the healing power of kindness, and of the profound, unexpected joy of a second chance at love and family. A few months later, on a quiet Sunday afternoon, the three of them were curled up on the sofa in their new home. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm, golden glow on their faces. Julian was reading a story aloud, his voice a low, comforting rumble. Leo was nestled between him and Elena, his head resting on his mother's lap, his small hand tucked into Julian's. Elena looked at the two people beside her, her son, safe and happy, the man she loved, his face relaxed and full of a peace she had helped him find. The ghosts of their pasts were finally at rest, not forgotten, but integrated into the beautiful new life they had built. The quiet in the room was not the cold, empty silence of loneliness, but the warm, full silence of contentment. It was the sound of a family. It was the sound of being home. And so, a story that began with a spilled cup of coffee in a humble cafe reached its beautiful conclusion. It serves as a powerful reminder that you never know what battle someone is fighting. A single act of kindness, no matter how small, can be the catalyst that changes a life, that heals a broken heart, that builds a new family from the fragments of what was lost. It teaches us that true wealth is not measured in dollars, but in the love we give and the grace we show to one another. If this story touched your heart and reminded you of the power of compassion, please take a moment to show your support. Your engagement helps us bring more inspiring content to you. Please like this video, share it with someone who might need a message of hope, and subscribe to our channel, Soul-Stirring Stories, for more tales that celebrate the best of the human spirit. Until next time, stay kind and keep believing in the possibility of miracles.